I will introduce the next speaker, Michael Mahoney, who is currently at University of California at Berkeley and also at International Computer Science Institute. And the title of Michael's talk is Why Deep Learning Works, Traditional and Heavy-tailed Implicit Self-Regularization in Deep Neural Nets. Michael, it's all yours.
All right, so just checking, you can hear me and see the lead slide?
We can hear you, but I don't see your slide.
Has I been screen shared with, or do I need to do that?
You need to screen share.
At the bottom of your screen, is there a share button?
Right, yeah.
The share button blocked out. It's in light gray.
Are you using a Mac? If you might have to click it and then accept some security.
Yeah, you need to open system preferences.
If you click that share button, it maybe it'll ask you already to approve.
So I tried to approve something.
Okay, and you might have to log in again.
Oh, I see. Maybe I need to log in again. Oh, all right, so I think I'm leaving the event, so I'll be back in a moment, I guess.
Sure.
Was it something we said?
So the share is still on gray, and now there's not a thing to click on there.
That's because I have to give you back the presenter ball. It's coming.
Okay. You are now a presenter. Share.
It's coming up. We see it.
All right. So you see the full screen mode and everything?
No, not the full. Yeah, now we see it. Yeah.
All right, great. All right, so after that detour, it's great to be here and to have the chance to tell you about some of the, I guess, work we've done recently. And we're trying to understand why deep learning works. I wanted to start with that question, why? Because there's actually very few people, I think, that ask a why question. And in fact, if I was to come up with a list of a handful of people, many of them are actually at this meeting. So, you know, very, very small fraction of people who they do deep learning or neural networks ask a why question. They tend to ask an engineering question. I want to build something, and you know, it works when it works, and you declare success then. So I want to ask a why question, and the form of the question, the form of the answer I'd want to give is let's say a scientific answer, because science has a well-defined methodology for answering why questions. You go measure stuff. You form a theory, by which I don't mean VC theory, which is sort of a bunch of theorems. I mean a predictive theory in a scientific sense, so not a theory in the sense of mathematical statistics or theoretical computer science. You make falsifiable predictions, and if your predictions are right, you say, I understand something. And so leaving aside sort of what understanding means in that sense, that's basically the approach I want to take. I want to understand why deep learning works. And this, the background on this is that, you know, I had done randomized linear algebra and large-scale graph algorithms and a range of sort of applications. And thinking about this from the perspective of mathematical statistics and theoretical computer science, and a lot of computational mathematics, which you didn't really need 10 years ago in machine learning, right? You get the data together and do 3 steps of an iteration. But I think as a practical matter, one of the things that's interesting about a lot of the current work in deep learning is it really stress tests questions in computational mathematics in interesting ways. So we started thinking about it that way, and I got to know Charles Martin, who's this work is with, at a meeting about 5 years ago, and he was saying, Michael, this is crazy. I mean, people are proving theorems that provide very weak bounds that don't depend on data. I mean, how can you understand this stuff if you don't look at that? And he says, it's obvious why it works, and I'll give you the answer now. And my answer answered him, I said, yeah, obviously that's why it works. So the question is, how can you describe what you just said in a way that's obvious to a machine learner as opposed to someone with a background in statistical mechanics. So a lot of the ideas we'll be using here come from statistical mechanics. And so the basic answer as to why it works is that for state-of-the-art models, I don't mean tiny little things, for state-of-the-art models, the training process, when you train to good data, which is what people do in practice, the training process engineers in correlations. There's an eye, there's a nose, there's a chin, correlations over many size scales. And those correlations are well modeled by heavy-tailed random matrix theory. And when you do that, you get your short circuit sort of the pathologies of Gaussian universality class type spin glasses. And so you get sort of a rugged convexity, a rugged well. And then you have SGD and noise and stochasticness. That's a temperature parameter. So of course, you're ruggedly convex, and so anything works. So that provides sort of an a posteriori answer to why deep learning works. And so I want to flesh that out. And if that was obvious to you what I said, good. And if it wasn't, hopefully, as I sort of walk through this, you'll see sort of how we're trying to explain it in a way that's more makes more sense to maybe practicing machine learners. So a little bit of background. So questions into why this works. One way to taxonomize the world is linear versus not if you're a linear algebra person, convex versus not if you're a convex optimization person, implicit versus explicit regularization if you're a regularization person. So we want to ask sort of basic questions there, but also very practical questions. We want to use this insight into improving engineering of neural networks, because neural networks are a practical business, and then they, I think, in some sense, demand a practical theory. So you can ask questions like, when is a network fully optimized? And it can't be that you drive training error to zero. Can you use labels or domain knowledge more efficiently? Large batch versus small batch. Designing better ensemble. So these sort of practical questions we want. This slide deck's from about a year ago. And so I interleave the thing we put up just to give you an example. So we have examples of all those practical questions, but an example of something you can do with the theory I'll describe. So we're going to ask a why question, but then we want to use it. An example of how you'd use it is something we put up: predicting trends in the quality of state-of-the-art neural networks without access to training data or testing data. And I think if you ask most machine learners or AI people or data scientists, can you predict the trends in the quality of state-of-the-art neural networks without access to any data? It's a sort of question that wouldn't even dawn on them, and they wouldn't even ask, and they'd say, of course not. Maybe distributional this, maybe Bayesian this, maybe worst case this, and you want to say, no. You are at a company, and I need to predict whether this model that someone gave me, they didn't tell me the knobs that they used during training, they didn't give me the data, they said, here's a model, use it. And I want to know whether this is a good model or not. Is this garbage or not? And if I don't give an answer to the boss tomorrow, I get fired. So this is a very practical question that you can imagine is of interest. And so can you predict the trends in state-of-the-art neural networks? And if sort of industrial scale machine learning is to really fit into an industrial pipeline, beyond maybe a handful of companies that can spend obscene amount of computing resources to train models, it's going to have to become siloed. And so you're going to have to answer questions like this, right? No one would build a bridge by trying to prove a theorem about Schrodinger's equation. You build a bridge by constructing phenomenological models. You stress test, you validate, you say, is the model you gave me any good? I don't necessarily know all the details of how you put it together, but I want to poke at it and see if it's any good. So can you predict the trends in the quality of state-of-the-art neural networks without access to any training or testing data? So the short answer is yes, and you can use the ideas we'll describe here. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but you can use the ideas we'll describe here. So the motivation in the background came on the top left. There was a paper a few years ago that described these things in terms of spin glasses. And if you know anything about spin glasses, they're sort of pathologically non-convex and extremely hard to work with. And we saw this and we thought that's a little bit strange. So the top left, the x-axis is some sort of energy or penalty, and the y-axis is a histogram or counts. And we looked at this and we said, this looks an awful lot like certain plots from the 90s when people were looking at protein folding theory. And the way you should think of it, protein folding theory is protein at the level of granularity I'll be talking about right now. Protein theories folding is the same as analyzing spike trains of neural networks. It's the same as analyzing financial time series. There's a very complicated, strongly correlated system that it's hard to understand at a granular level, so you'll poke at it. A little along the lines of the renormalization group ideas that you heard at the end of the last talk. Except here you don't have a nice static equilibrium system. And so is there a difference between a random heteropolymer and a protein, which I mean a natural protein that appears in a system? Is there a difference between a random graph, of interactions between biological neurons and the actual neurons that appear in the brain? If you think the answer is yes, how do you characterize it? So that's basically the ideas we're going to be using here. And so the other thing that sort of caught our attention was there was a paper that got the best paper award in ICLR, which is sort of the publication venues for neural networks. And it got the best paper award. This isn't some paper that barely made it across the finish line. This got the best paper award. And basically it said, to understand deep learning, we need to go back and rethink generalization. And this really struck me as strange because, you can argue about whether the paper is good or bad, but an area valued this so much that it gave it the best paper award. And they said, our ideas completely fail to understand what's going on here. And, we said basically, rethinking generalization requires going back and, revisiting old ideas and reading old books. So there's an approach that was sort of a competitor and to VC theory ideas having to do with characterizing typical case. And typical is not average, it's typical. There's a important technical difference. Typical case complexity using ideas from statistical mechanics. Now, that's not to say if you go back and dust off those old books and apply the ideas in a vanilla way, you'll do well. You certainly won't. But if you use the ideas having to do with entropy, and if you use the ideas having to do with typicalness of models, and use the ideas of a phase diagram, the sort of things that you're hearing about these days, it provides an alternative to uniform convergence and worst case sort of bounds. And so it became sort of obvious to us here that there was a big blind spot in the area, and so we decided to flesh these ideas out. So it's sort of set up just to give some sort of heuristic notation. I mean, there's a lot of details here, but we want to think of an objective function or an energy or an optimization, and in a neural network, there's weights W and biases B, and there might be filter functions H, and there could be transformers and convolutions and a lot of other things going on here. But think if you have an objective, and the way most of these models are trained is you do the following. You're going to train this on labeled data. Let's say there's a D and D comma Y. You're going to use backprop, which is an efficient way to backpropagate derivatives of errors. And what I want you to think of as after training, right, at any fixed step, this doesn't depend on the data. Maybe I should have had an argument here, but this doesn't depend on the data. I could talk about this and reason about this without access to the data. So in particular, if I give you a pre-trained model, you could ask questions of it. You could poke at it. This may change as the weights and biases change. The way a random quadratic function is different than a non-random quadratic, for example, in high dimensions. But you can ask questions of this and we do that. And one way to taxonomize the world is into convex and not, and this function on the previous slide is not even close to convex. So you're sort of in with a nice two-dimensional picture. You just think about something on the left, and what you see is basically on the right. When I say what you see is, operationally, if you run these things, you just never have a problem with local minima. I mean, as a practical matter, you just don't. And this is not a new insight today, and it's not a new insight 2 years ago when I made an earlier version of the slides. This has been known for a long time. I mean, it was known long enough that into textbooks by about 2000. Saddle points, maybe some subtleties, but local minima was never a problem. And so for a couple of years, machine learners were saying you might get stuck in local minima if you run SGD or whatever. I mean, just never a problem. The solution was basically to add more capacity, make bigger models, add more weights, and then regularize. And by regularize, you fiddle with various knobs that have the effect of regularization. This is not something that's sort of a first-class citizen in theoretical computer science or theory of algorithms. It's a very natural thing in machine learning. And so what is regularization? Essentially, everything is regularization, because solving a problem exactly versus solving it approximately, the objective function values may be epsilon close, but it's not well posed in the sense that all sorts of other properties of the system are just very, very different. And so essentially anything you do, you can drop out, you can do early stopping, you can change batch size, you can noisify data. I mean, anything has the effect of regularization. And this is a point I want to talk about, because what we're going to do is talk about this in an a posteriori way and characterize the implicit regularization in these models. Namely, we're not going to say this is what I'm going to do and I'm going to hope for such and such. We're going to say this is what state-of-the-art people did. These are state-of-the-art models. We're not going to do any training. And we want to characterize the implicit regularization in these models. So let me talk a little bit about regularization, and then I can describe sort of the result. So this is a long, big, complicated area. To oversimplify, think of regularization as ridge regression. I want to solve least squares, wx equals y. it's singular, it's more constraints than variables, there's no solution. And so I tack on more pseudo inverse. So I tack on a ridge regularization term. There's an inverse here. It's a more Penrose pseudo's inverse if it's not invertible. And the point here is that in the bottom line, I have minimize over x of wx minus y, something, f, plus alpha or lambda g. So I have two terms. There's a bicriteria. I stick in an additive correction, alpha, sometimes it's lambda, and I want to optimize this bicriteria. Said another way, there's a natural scale in the data. Below that scale, your noise, or you're consistent with the hypothesis of noise. Above that scale, your signal. And that could have an L1 or an L2, and you're sparse and you're ridge. I mean, so there's a lot of detail here. But basically, there's a scale in the problem. Above that scale, your signal. Below that scale, your noise. All right? The energy landscape. The energy landscape is this messy objective. One way to do it is to say, well, I want to apply regulation here at each step, and I'm going to iterate. But of course, that doesn't regularize the entire problem. That regularizes each step. You could ask yourself, what do I get at the end of the day? Did I solve a regularized problem or not? Or can I characterize that? So essentially what we're going to do is to try and turn off, to the extent possible, all regularization. And we're going to sort of systematically turn it back on. And we're going to study the empirical properties of the learned weight matrices W. So the idea you should have is, say that I am code. And I'm not going to tell you what I solve, but I'm going to say I'm going to solve a least squares type problem, maybe regularized in some way. And if you give me data and I always give you back a sparse solution, you might say, oh, there's L1 regularization under the hood. You look inside my code and it says call LAPACK L1 solver. If you give me lots of solutions and I always give you back something and then there's an answer and then a bunch of coordinates have small values, you might say, oh, you're solving ridge regression. You look inside the hood and you say, oh, yeah, call LAPACK ridge solver, whatever. Of course, you may call me and I always give you back something sparse. And you look inside my code and I'm just a big mess of spaghetti code. I go up and I go down and it's go to and it's left and it's right. And you might say I'm solving L1 regularization because I always return you a sparse answer. And you'd be right. And I may not even know you're right. I might just be spaghetti code. And but if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, so you're characterizing after the fact. You're poking at me and trying to determine the problem that I'm implicitly solving. So that's essentially what we're doing. Not in the context of least squares, but in the context of state-of-the-art models. So we analyze lots and lots of neural networks. So, not one or two or three. I mean, essentially every state-of-the-art model out there, literally hundreds. So a few toy ones like Linnet 5 on MNIST and a 3-layer MLP. But essentially, there's 2 years ago, this wasn't the case, but now there's hundreds of computer vision models, maybe 1,000. There's a couple hundred natural language models, BERT, these sorts of things, GPT. And so we've looked at every one of them. And so when you look at that many, there's always an exception to a rule. I'll highlight a few, but what I'll be telling you about is sort of the rule, and there's a few exceptions here and there. So what are we going to look at? You could look at weight norms. There's a lot of things you could look at. We sort of looked at entropy. This is one of the first things we looked at on the left. And then our toy model we trained, and we saw this go down. And we looked at spectral properties on the right, and we saw that this went down. This is the spectral properties and the entropy of a certain weight layer matrix. And so you say, oh, this is going down a lot. This must be a significant signal. But you look at the scale of the y-axis and you're going from 0.99 to maybe 0.98. So is that significant? It certainly looks it, but it's hard to know. We looked at it, we poked around a while. We looked at scree plots. If you know what a scree plot is, it's just a plot of eigenvectors. Scree plots, they tell you nothing, essentially. And so we ended up looking at this through a certain lens, through a lens of a histogram of the eigenvalues. And what we saw is the following. On the left here, in red, is what you see at the very beginning of training. We're training a toy thing here. I said we were looking at state-of-the-art, but this is a toy thing. And you see a semicircle. This is Wigner semicircle. It's a quarter circle here, but this is a Wigner semicircle. At the end of training, you see the blue. It's a semicircle with a little blip. If you know random matrix theory, this you want to jump up and down because you say going on at the beginning, and that doesn't tell you much about state-of-the-art neural networks. That just tells you that people randomize. Use a random matrix to initialize. But what you see at the end is that you're random plus a little spike. Statisticians call this a bulk plus spike model. So we saw this and we thought this is the tip of a good iceberg and drilled down. And so what's actually going on in models is much more complicated, but you can analyze it through this lens. So we're going to poke at these weight matrices after the fact, trying to characterize their implicit regularization properties. And the point here is that if you have some large eigenvalues, that's the signal. You have small ones, that's noise. This is an a posteriori characterization of implicit regularization. So This is after the fact saying what you solved was a regularized problem. If you have a big spectral gap here between the bulk edge and the spike, that is a notion of regularity, and statistical models do well when you regularize appropriately. And so what's going to work is that when you train, why deep learning is going to work is when you train state-of-the-art models to good data, you get an implicit regularization. It's going to be a much more subtle form than this, but that's sort of going to be the approach, the methodological approach we'll take. Nothing we're doing here is complicated. This is the code. It takes, except for a few large layers and state-of-the-art NLP models, all these matrices are a couple hundred by a couple thousand or smaller. So this isn't obscenely expensive in terms of compute time. Again, to train a toy model, epoch 0, 4 up to 36, you start off random, and what you do is very quickly you pull a slight spike out, and you can train a factor of 10 more from 4 to 40, and you pull it out from size scale 3 to 4. And so this is suggesting that you may be pulling out a bit of structure. We'll get back to this, but this is suggesting you may be pulling out a bit of structure. Okay, so I want to give you a 101, 102, 103 on random matrix theory, because the toy stuff we'll be talking about here, we can get a much richer set of things, but it sits on top of that, but there's a few subtleties. So in 3 slides, I think I'll give you sort of the just a quick overview of the way we're going to, the types of random matrix theory that we're going to use. So if you know 101 about random matrix theory, it's Wigner's semicircle law, which basically says that you have a bulk and all your eigenvalues fit into that semicircle. Fluctuations at the edge of the bulk are different. They're not the usual sort of fluctuations you'd get from just coin flipping. You have a large right side, and it's because on the one side of this you're capturing correlations, and the other side they're more or less IID, and so it's known as a Tracy-Widom fluctuation. It's a Tracy-Widom window, and so essentially we want to identify a bulk region, a fluctuational region, and we want to know if things are sticking outside that. So a lot of work here, and this is the 101 if you know just a little bit of random matrix theory. Sort of a 10 and a 102 is that weight matrices are not square. The semicircle literally is a semicircle, but weight matrices are not square. You can apply the same ideas to rectangular matrices. You don't get a semicircle, you get this function. This is known as the Marchenko-Pasteur distribution. It looks a little bit complicated, but its shape looks like this. And depending on the aspect ratio Q, depending on the noise scale sigma, it adopts one of these shapes. So you should think of this as the rectangular version of Marchenko-Pasteur. And in particular, you still have an edge and you have Tracy-Widom fluctuations at the edge. So we want to characterize the bulk phase and what's going on in terms of outliers. Going beyond Gaussian universality class, going beyond Wigner type, Marchenko-Pasteur type matrices was very important for what we did. And we needed to use essentially heavy-tailed random matrix theory. And this is a rather complicated slide, but you have basic Marchenko-Pasteur, you have spiked covariance. If you consider Levy flights, if you consider heavy-tailed random matrices, you could operationalize this with a dynamics with Levy flights instead of a Gaussian dynamics, or you could exogenously say I'm going to be power law with a parameter mu. The universality classes are not as robust as they are for the Gaussian universality class, so this is oversimplifying it, but roughly, if your exponent is larger than 4, you behave one way. If your exponent's between 2 and 4, you behave another way, and if it's less than 2, you behave another way. So if you know 4 moment assumptions from random matrix theory, when you're above 4, things behave one way. They're sort of weakly heavy-tailed. They may be heavy-tailed in certain ways, but you get MP-type results in certain limits. When the heavy-tail exponent is very small, oftentimes one element dominates or something, and so it's less interesting in that sense from the perspective of heavy-tailed statistics or robust statistics. The interesting regime is when you're between 2 and 4, and you're not a perturbative approximation of either. So Chernoff bounds, these sort of things just fall apart. Oftentimes you get different results asymptotically than you do at finite sizes, meaning that the finite size corrections are non-perturbative. So a lot of subtleties that I'm going to gloss over here. Fitting heavy-tailed distributions is very complicated. Let me just leave it at that. There's lots of size effects. Let me just leave it at that. And to say, I think we did dotted I's and crossed T's carefully. So there's a lot of subtleties. This isn't like you do a Gaussian fit and you get a nice concentration. A lot of subtleties. So let me go into some more details. So what I want to do is measure empirical results. And so now we know the right lens to do. We're going to look at this thing through its spectral structure. If you're familiar with physics, think you have a Hamiltonian and you look at its spectra, right? That tells you lots about energy states and lots about internal dynamics. That's all we're doing. We're going to look at the spectral structure of these weight layers. We're not going to be doing training. We're going to look at pre-trained models. And what, if anything, can I tell from that? So let's look at more detailed empirical results. So as I said, I'm going to show you a few things here, but we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of things, and with a handful of exceptions, everything on that are the exceptions prove the rule. If I go into details on, what we're seeing is the following. So Linnet 5. If you don't know what Linnet 5, this is a state-of-the-art model 20 years ago, and it was used to classify MNIST digits, for instance. If you pull out a single layer, the first fully connected layer, what you see here is blue. This is a histogram of eigenvalues. Eigenvalues, histogram, you see the blue, and then you see a bunch of stuff out here. We zoomed in on the right. The best MP fit is in red. So that's pretty good, actually. Now, you can argue about whether 3.5 or 3.75 is a Tracy-Widom edge. I don't know. But 4.5 is outside it, and 20 is outside it. So what you see here is something very well fit by MP, and then a whole bunch of other stuff sticking out. Small models, you see this. State-of-the-art models from 20 years ago, you see this. At about 2013, there was an inflection point in the quality of models, and I could show you 500 plots that look something like this. So I'm showing you not on log-log scale. So this is not to justify the heavy tail, but it's to illustrate something. So there's a lot of machinery to come up with good estimators. But what you see is that the best red fit is very bad. There's a lot of mass that's eaten out here. And you do not have a crisp NP edge. You have mass that bleeds out. And I cut it off at 4. This one up to 20 also. So you have a huge range of outliers. If you plot this on log-log and semi-log plots, in a lot of cases, it's reasonably well fit by power law, sometimes log normals or something, but strongly heavy-tailed. There's a few exceptions. Look at inception V3, for example, you see something going on. This is probably a signature of a model that's been under-optimized. It was two different models and pasted together and under-optimized. So there's a few exceptions here, and I'll talk about a few others. But essentially, the 99% you should think of as very, very well fit by a heavy tail distribution, and parametrically will work with power laws, but you don't need to. So here I want to construct, so we have a bunch of observations, and essentially every weight matrix out there is heavy-tailed. Older models, are reasonably well fit, at least the bulk by Marchenko Pasteur, but everything out there is not even close, and it's reasonably well fit by a heavy-tailed distribution like a power law. So now we've made a bunch of observations. Now I want to construct a theory, not a bunch of theorems. We're going to use the theorems, but we're going to construct a predictive theory in a sense, and the theory basically go back to the heavy-tailed random matrix theory and posit the existence of a bunch of end states of training. So one is going to be random-like. You look at the model, you pull out weight matrices, they're random. Maybe they're not random, right? Maybe this model on the top left gets good predictive accuracy, but through the lens of global random matrix theory, it looks consistent with the hypothesis of random. I could be bulk plus spike in C here, which is what we saw before. You're random with one or two are full of spikes. Statisticians would call bulk plus spike. And you're going to be heavy-tailed, not even close to those. You're well approximated maybe by heavy-tailed random matrix theory on the spectra, not on the weight matrices. And you're in a class in between the two, you bleed out, which is sort of between random-like and bulk plus spike. You get some non-trivial stuff at the Tracy-Widom regime. And you have a bulk decay where the bulk really gets eaten out. So there's random-like, there's bulk plus spikes, there's heavy-tailed. And the way you should think of this is there's interest now in extremely rectangular, I think it's called NTK limits, where people, prove theorems and say, in this limit, weight matrices don't change and I get good generalization. Empirical question. That could be the way the world is. The world could look like state-of-the-art models look like random-like. We've only looked at 500, 600, 700 of them, and the answer is never, it does. But, that could be the end state of the world, right? So this is a real thing. It could be this way. Linnet 5 behaved, basically, it could be that you always get bulk plus spike. Statistician will be happy with that because you can go back and use bulk plus spike theory. That's a perturbative correction of MP theory, a Gaussian universality class theory. You could be heavy-tailed, where you're not a perturbative approximation of either. And you also have a corner case. We call this 5+1 phases, because you can actually have rank collapse. Important for MP theory is that the minimum eigenvalue is well separated from 0. So if you see 0 eigenvalues to machine precision, single or double, it's not random. It's distinctly different than random. And so that's usually a sign of some sort of degeneracy in an undertrained or damaged model. a slide with a lot of words that just says the same thing that that picture did. Lots and lots of technical issues to go through. So so basically we wanted to understand state-of-the-art models. We went out and looked at a few things. We saw that the right lens to look through toy models was through the spectral structure. Think of a Hamiltonian where you're looking at energy levels, and I want to understand internal dynamics. And this is, this is exactly how Wigner used random matrix theory, right? He said, I want to understand the structure of large nuclei. There's all this junk going on. I can't understand it. I'm going to posit that this stuff up here is random, and there's something interesting going on down here, and I'm going to ignore this. This is the way he used it, right? He didn't prove limit theorems. He used it. That's what we're doing. We're saying, the learned model is some big, complicated thing. Yeah, it's hard to understand. We're going to look at it through this lens. Then we went out and looked at, 500,000 models, and we saw that, the 98%, 99% have this heavy-tailed structure. They're not Gaussian universality. They're not, they're not bulk plus spike. They're very, very different, and we want to understand what's going on. So what does this have to do with implicit regularization? Because I said the regularization we're characterizing in an a posteriori way, but well-regularized models are good in some sense. What this says is that, if you think of low-rank perturbation, low rank plus some spike, a perturbative correction to a Gaussian universality class model, essentially that's what Linnet 5 is. Remember, regularization is F plus lambda G. There's an additive term that modulates the interaction between the two. And you're saying below a certain scale, your noise, above that scale, your signal. So what bulk plus spike, what we saw in Linnet 5 is there's a scale, the Tracy-Widom edge. Above that, there's a bunch of spikes. Below that, you're consistent with the hypothesis of random. So if you train this to MNIST and you get rid of this bulk and you look at just these 8 or however many eigenvalues there are, you get, I don't know the number, 90% prediction accuracy. So 95, is that good or bad? It's less than 99.8, but it's better than 10%, and it's better than 92% or whatever a strawman model would get. So this does have real signal, and there is real signal buried in here. But as a modeling assumption, what you're saying is I'm going to introduce a scale, and above that scale I'm signal, and below that scale I'm noise. So smaller, older models like Linnet 5 look like traditional regularization, which you'd learn in the textbook. They can be described with Gaussian and matrix theory ideas. Essentially, everything else does not. And the reason is we've described the spectra here in terms of a heavy-tailed random matrix. If you look at the elements of W, the elements of W typically are not heavy-tailed. It's the correlations. It's W transpose W. It's the eigenvalues in W transpose W. So one way to get heavy tails on eigenvalues is to be element-wise heavy-tailed. That's less interesting than if element-wise you have roughly elements of the same size and you have heavy tails in the correlations. This is exactly, well, it's a dynamic analog of the which is on the previous talk with the icing model. You have correlations over large size scales. Even though each spin is just up or down, you have correlations over large size scales. So what you see here is in state-of-the-art trained models, W tends to have a size scale by design. That's just what people do in practice. But correlations are heavy-tailed. There's not a good size scale. It's not like I can cut here and say, here's a Tracy-Widom edge. Cut there. Above that, your signal. Below that, your noise. You eat out this bulk. You have a bunch of eigenvalues going on here. And essentially, you're not a high-dimensional ball. You're not a low-dimensional pancake, which is what SVD assumes, right? You have 10 dimensions that are large and the rest are small. You're a ellipsoid that has a heavy tail over the long axes. So these models are not random. They're very, very not random. You've trained them to death by looking at data. They're very, very strongly correlated. And so think of a realistic model of the brain, or think of a realistic model of a natural protein, or think of a realistic model of a financial time series. And we're going to literally, the heavy-tailed random matrix ideas there were ideas from Bouchard and Potter that were using this in those contexts. And this grew out of ideas from neuroscience in terms of understanding heavy-tailed distribution. So we're modeling signal, not noise, by heavy-tailed random matrices. And essentially all large modern DNNs exhibit the sort of heavy-tailed self. So these models work because when you train to good data, you cook in heavy-tailed self-regularization, and there's not a natural size scale. So a summary of what we think is going on is there's not a natural scale threshold. You can damage models, so they are, but you're not a simple low-rank approximation for W, which may not be surprising, but you're certainly not. You get contributions from correlations on all size scales, and you really can't treat it perturbatively in a meaningful way. All right. Talked about eigenvalues. You can talk about eigenvectors and a range of other things. You can look at vector entropies and localization ratios. You can look at other things. So just in the interest of time, let me not go into that. But we have results. Spikes have less entropy. They're more localized in the bulk, which you'd expect from bulk plus spike models and from Levy flight sort of models. So the range of other things would confirm what I've been just. You see this very, very ubiquitously. This is a plot of the alpha value, the fitted power law exponent value, and a histogram of when you see them in ImageNet, in an Allen NLP, which is an NLP model. So one of the interesting things you see is that, for example, look at GPT and GPT-2. So GPT, this is not BERT, but it's a large model, and GPT was pushed out the door, and you had a distribution of eigenvalues. This is a distribution of power law exponents of eigenvalues. And you had a peak here near 4, which is not 2. It's a little bit larger than we saw in the computer vision model. And GPT-2, that was better trained and came out 6 months or a year later, has this whole distribution pushed down. So the idea is that smaller power law exponents, you're lower in that middle universality class, and that would correspond to correlations over long size scales mediating the interactions. So you see that here. And you see that in a range of other ways, and I'll get to something in a minute. But before I do that, I want to say, so now we constructed a theory, and the theory was using random matrix ideas that we should have 5 end states of training. So we've used this in a bunch of ways. But one way I want to describe, when a way to exhibit you have particularly strong control in a predictive sense, and I mean scientific predictive sense, not predicting training error, is to say I have all these moving parts. Can I change one knob and have control? And so we said, if everything's a regularization parameter, we ought to be able to change things, step size or dropout or learning weight. And we posited the existence of 5 phases of training. We haven't proven it. And can we exhibit all 5 phases of training by changing just one parameter, in particular batch size? So size is an interesting parameter because batch size, the way this works is you run a stochastic gradient algorithm. Typically, you pull a bunch of data, you compute and that bunch is of some batch, 128 or whatever. And I compute an approximate gradient, and then I make a decision on where to move. I think people want large batches for 2 reasons. One, if you prove theorems, about SGD, you typically, even these things are wildly non-convex, you assume something's convex. And the structure of the theory basically says if the batches are larger, a variance is smaller, you look more deterministic. And so that's basically the structure of the theory for a lot of SGD optimization algorithms. That's changing a little bit in the last year or 2, but certainly for the last 10 years. So you want larger batches because it gives you better, you're essentially more deterministic. I think people also want larger batches because if you're really implementing this stuff, larger batches have better communication properties in terms of latency and throughput. And so people really want to get to large batch sizes. A lot of evidence, including stuff we'll show you, is that batch size is a regularization parameter, and smaller batches are better for generalization. A little bit of this stuff, and to show you these figures are actually from large batch size experiments. Something. This is the second place we trained. Nowhere else did we train. Second place we trained, and this was AlexNet, a mini version of AlexNet. We pull out, in this case, the FC1 layer. You can look at other layers, and at batch size 500. And for all batch size, you can have different stopping rules. For batch size 500, you look random like. Batch size 250. Batch size 100, you start to get a little bit of stuff coming out here. Smaller. A little bit smaller. Batch size 16, you clearly have, you have a spike. You have a spike, but you're eating a little bit of mass out of the bulk. You have a spike, but you're eating more and more mass out of the bulk at batch size 8. Batch size 4, clearly heavy-tailed. So decreasing batch size induces stronger correlations in the learned weight matrices. So this is a control parameter. This is a knob. And its effect is that you get implicitly heavier tail self-regularization. More regularized models are better, so smaller batches are better. So there's some more details there that I glossed over, but that's the idea. And increasing the batch sizes just washes out these correlations in W, and you get less and less implicitly regularized models. Right, so you could tell a just so story and say large batch sizes are better, and I'm going to compensate this with step size and this and that. But of course, step size is another knob. If you're stopping rules, you train to 0 error, 99.9% training error, 99% you may get one set of results. What we're exhibiting here is that we can exhibit all 5 phases of training by changing a single parameter. Right, which is a much more compelling statement that you have control on the theory than if everything's a hyperparameter and you spend $10,000 or $100,000 in GPU time, and you show that you can exhibit all 5 phases, and you don't really know why. I mean, here we know it for batch size. We could do the same thing with learning rate or other parameters. Not claiming this transition always happens at size scale 4 versus 15. Not claiming you can see all of these phases for every choice of batch sizes and models and so on. You may not, right? If the model's small enough, you may fail to exhibit the heavy tail. I mean, prop models have certain aspect ratios. Something may saturate, and you may fail to see everything. But this sort of provides a phase diagram to map some of these things out. So we applied random matrix theory. We got 5 + 1 phases of training. I said this is remarkably ubiquitous. How are we going to use the theory? So I want to talk about how we'll use the theory, and then maybe just some more general implications. So this, as I said, this slide deck's about a year old, and I interleaved that one slide. I'm actually going to slip it back in a little bit. And the question we want to ask here is, we want to predict test accuracies. And this is actually predates the archive paper I showed you. And so a lot of people say, well, VC's, no good. I should use weight norms. But the structure of the theory is very similar. You might get a uniform convergence bound. Regardless, you get a bound, general, and the form of the statement is, if I satisfy such and such conditions, then I get a bound. That's very different than you would use in practical engineering applications, where you say, I want a metric, and I want to predict that metric and get this number. If you use these sort of metrics, sometimes you correlate, sometimes you anti-correlate with predictive quality. Sometimes you're orders of magnitude off, sometimes you're not. So there's a huge theory practice gap. And the question we wanted to ask was, can you predict trends in test accuracy without peeking at the data? And I learned in this business you need a good name, and so and you need good software. So we wanted to have software to watch, the weight matrices, either of pre-trained models or during training. And so we have code called Weight Watcher. If you search on Weight Watcher, you won't find our code, but if you search on pip install Weight Watcher, you will. So go search on pip install Weight Watcher. The other thing I learned is that you need a well-defined metric of success in this business. So our metric of success will be when we get our cease and desist order and we have to change our name from Weight Watcher to something else. But for the meantime, pip install Weight Watcher, and you can try and break our code and break what we did and reproduce it. So we have very reproducible code, which I think is actually something else that's sort of seriously lacking in this area. We have a heuristic argument why power laws.
Wrap up.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes to wrap up.
Yep. Why these heavy tails might be the... So essentially, we're saying you have correlations over many sizes. It's not at all well described by Gaussian universality classes. We used heavy-tailed random matrix theory. That's captured by a power law exponent. So I don't want to claim there's power laws here. This is a model. It's a model. But you can fit power law exponents, and here's a heuristic argument that says that smaller power laws are better and should be predictive of the model quality. Fast forward 6 months or a year, and you get this result I put before. So we can predict, go out, look at state-of-the-art BERT models, state-of-the-art computer vision, and predict trends in the quality of state-of-the-art models. There's a few exceptions that prove the rule. You can look at, like Intel has distilled models. They want to distill. You take this, distillation's a well-defined metric, you distill it. The norms oftentimes behave in some crazy way depending on stuff because you're shuffling around mass and so on. The heavy tail exponents still do remarkably well. GPT-2 series, that is interesting because one of the early models was released and trained to poor data because they said this is too remarkable a model. We can't reproduce the good model. We're going to reproduce a damaged form of the model. Then a year later, a better form of the model was, in fact, reproduced. It was trained on good data, and then a year later, an update trained on still better data, and you'd get the trends that you'd expect, the predictive trends from the theory. Norms behave however they. So as a general rule, norms can discriminate between good, better, best in a series of reasonably well-trained models, but they can't answer the question: is the model good or not? Can I discriminate between good and bad models? Which is arguably the point of wanting to poke at a model that you haven't in a sort of an industrial environment, maybe, or a scientific environment. We don't have access to training and testing data and all the knobs that were used to design it. So to wrap up, the more general thought, I think, in the back of our mind, and I think this will probably synergize with what some people know about in terms of neural spike trains. In the back of our mind, we were thinking about correlations over many size scales, either in the neural example or in the protein structure example. And you could take a random heteropolymer, by which I mean a random sequence of amino acids, and heat it up and cool it down, heat it up and cool it down, and you never, ever, ever fold to the same state. It'll take the age of the universe just for combinatorial reasons. It's called protein folding. It's called the Leventhal paradox. If you take a natural protein, one in your body, and you heat it up, cool it down, heat it up, cool it down, you can do that 1,000 times, and you'll always fold to the same state. Why? And the answer is because evolution or whatever cooked in correlations over many size scales. There's alpha helices, there's beta sheets, whatever. And that gives you sort of a rugged convexity. And this correlations over many size scales short circuits the pathologies of random interactions that are all in the Gaussian universality class that are fine and easy to analyze and very good. But then when the temperature parameter is small enough, they just choke and you hit a spin glass phase. So the heavy tail interactions sort of short circuit that. So that's sort of the intuition as to why these things work. And there's a range of implications there in terms of the rugged convexity that are interesting more generally. Okay. So with that, let me wrap up. You can pip install Weight Watcher if you want to try and reproduce these results. And I think the main empirical results are that you have, you're nothing like the sort of assumptions people would want to make in terms of a perturbative approximation of Gaussian random matrix theory. Instead, what you have is very, very strongly correlated systems that can be modeled with heavy-tailed random matrix theory. And when you do that, you can get a semi-empirical or a phenomenological model that can do things like predict quality of state-of-the-art models. I mean, these are models that you read about in the news. Predict the quality and trend quality and state-of-the-art neural network models without, for example, any access to training and testing data. The ideas we used here are all under the hood along the lines of information theory and statistical mechanics, and I think it's sort of a promising direction to think about more generally in terms of the area. So with that, let me wrap up, and either there's questions now or I'll be around in an hour if there's questions also. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Michael.